Our next guest is David Holtz, Assistant Professor of Management of Organizations at Berkeley's Haas School of Business. We'll be talking about online marketplaces today, how to integrate AI and generative language models in today's online marketplace, and how to design the optimal online marketplace and e-commerce platform for tomorrow. A shout out from our sponsor, NordVPN. If you click on the link down below at nordvpn.com/David Lin, you'll get 65% off a 2-year plan. David, welcome to the show. It's good to speak to you. I'm excited to talk to you about today's topics. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Excited to talk about your areas of research. You've been involved in industry as well as academia. Tell us a little bit about your areas of research, and then we'll get into large language models and AI.
Sure. Happy to talk about that. So I actually came to academic research through a sort of circuitous route. I actually started life as a physicist, had started a physics PhD, took a leave of absence that became indefinite, and came out to the Bay Area and worked in tech for a bit as a data scientist, first in ad tech, and then eventually moved to Airbnb, where I worked for a couple of years. And at Airbnb, I became introduced to a number of problems that I found pretty interesting around how you design online marketplaces and online platforms. There's a lot of decisions that go into the design of these platforms that people
Mhm.
don't think about too often. How do you design the search interface? How do you design the reputation and rating system that people use? Things like that. And found that I wanted to think about them in a more academic way, which is what led me back to graduate school and eventually here to Berkeley. So a lot of my work, generally speaking, has focused on the design of online marketplaces and online platforms, thinking about reputation systems, the recommendation algorithms that are key features of these platforms, things like search. And increasingly, I've been thinking about AI and large language models and how these new technologies might get folded into online markets and online platforms and change the way that they are built and designed moving forward.
A lot of buzzwords we've used already, AI and large language models. Certainly, a lot of people have been misusing these words I've seen on in the media. You're an expert in these fields, so maybe let's clarify to the audience what we mean by a large language model. I think the general understanding is still relatively in its infancy from the general public, at least. And so most people, when they think about large language models, they think about ChatGPT, but not further beyond that. So maybe tell us about your research on large language models and how they can be applied to the marketplace today.
Sure. Yeah. So I think in defining large language models, I study the impacts of these models and not building them myself. So I definitely don't want to overclaim my expertise. But the way that I think about large language models relative to other existing forms of AI is basically they're trained on these large corpora, these large bodies of text, and are essentially doing prediction. So you're asking them a question, and then they're trying to construct the sequence of words or tokens that they think would give you the best possible answer to the query that you've put forward. This is in contrast to a lot of previous AI implementations where it's a little bit more, it's the underlying model is a lot different. And so I think insofar as ChatGPT is the thing that people are most familiar with, I think that gives you a really, pretty solid foundation for thinking about what types of things these models can do. But there's all sorts of language models out there besides ChatGPT. So ChatGPT is trained on one particular set of data that is a little bit opaque to folks. No one really knows what the underlying training data set is for ChatGPT. But you could have other language models that are trained on different data sets. You could have models that have different numbers of parameters. So basically, how complex are those models? How sophisticated are they? And you can also sort of fine tune these models in a lot of different ways as well. So I have a couple of different projects right now where we're trying to understand what the potential economic impacts of these models are, and also how people interact with them. And I think this research is going to have implications for how we might think about integrating language models into online markets, online platforms. So to quickly give quick summaries of these projects. So I'm involved in one collaboration with some colleagues here at Berkeley Haas, as well as folks over at HBS, where we've actually run a field experiment in Kenya, where we randomly gave a sample of small business owners there access to a large language model, in this case, actually GPT-4, so the model that sits underneath of ChatGPT. And so we randomly gave some of those business owners access to this language model to basically interact with it as a business mentor, right? So asking them questions asking the model questions about, how can I improve my business? I'm facing a lot of competition. Maybe I want to expand my product offerings. What should I do? And the entrepreneurs that were not given access to this language model were instead giving access to standard PDF business guides that are often used in emerging markets like Kenya. And I think based on other research that's been done and a lot of the buzz that you've heard about language models, you might expect that just by virtue of giving these small business owners access to language models, you would see huge improvements in the profitability of their businesses, and the number of sales that they're experiencing, things like that. What we see is actually a little bit more of a complicated story, right? So overall, we don't see much impact of giving folks access to these language models. But when we look at different subsamples of the data, what we're actually seeing is that the entrepreneurs that were, successful entrepreneurs prior to our experiment did even better when given access to the model.
Mm.
And those that were less successful entrepreneurs beforehand, they had a hard time extracting value from the model, and it actually led them to do a little bit worse. And so, when we think about a market like Airbnb or like Etsy, where you have a bunch of small business owners, and these people often don't have business degrees or formal training in running a business. They're folks that started doing something on the side and became more serious about it. A language model might help them be more sophisticated business operators and think about how to price, how to set their availability, things like that. But I think what we're learning from this study is that, it's not as simple as just give folks access to the model and expect that it's going to lead to huge improvements in performance. There's actually a bit of training perhaps that needs to be done to teach people how to really get a lot of value out of these tools. I have another project where we're actually just trying to really understand how people actually interact with these models and how they learn to use them. So I think we've all experienced, you open up ChatGPT for the first time and you're trying to just figure out how to get that model to do what you want it to do. It's a new type of technology, it's a new tool, and I think we're all kind of trying to wrap our heads around what it can do, what it can't, and how to get it to do exactly what we want. And so we're running some lab experiments to ask people to complete different tasks with slightly different models and just seeing what types of strategies they employ when they're trying to kind of, get this machine to hum in the way that they want it to.
Okay. Can you provide some real life applications of this? So you were talking to us about some businesses that you have worked with or that have looked into adopting large language models. Some have been more successful than others. Can you maybe just walk us through a practical application of how exactly they've applied this into selling their products, what kind of products and what kind of businesses? Maybe just talk about the successful ones.
Sure. To be frank, I have been a little bit surprised to have not seen more widespread adoption and implementation of language models in business yet. When ChatGPT first sort of took the world by storm about a year ago, I really expected that there would be a huge transformation and that we'd see these tools implemented in all sorts of different e-commerce flows really quickly. And while that's starting to happen, I think we're still waiting to see some really, successful transformative implementations of the technology in existing e-commerce businesses. But I think that there are a lot of opportunities for it to be really transformative, and I expect to see some of those in the near future. So to give you some examples of
Yeah.
how I think these tools could be implemented, right? Imagine that you are a traveler that is using Airbnb to find a place to stay. Right now, the Airbnb search experience has a number of search filters. So suppose that I'm traveling to New York. I can say I want to stay in a certain neighborhood. Maybe I want an entire home. Maybe I want to make sure that there are two beds in the home. But I think for many people, a big selling point of using a platform like Airbnb as opposed to staying in a traditional hotel is that all these different listings are, sort of idiosyncratic and different, and they have different styles and designs, and you want to stay in a place that really feels custom to you or tailored to your preferences. And right now, that's really hard to do in that search interface, right? There's a lot of scrolling, there's a lot of like bookmarking different things that you might like. And that's kind of the traditional search interface. Consider in contrast, a search interface where you visited Airbnb and what you typed in was, I'm looking for a place to stay in
Yeah.
Brooklyn that's close to subways like the F or the L train that has an airy modern aesthetic that reminds me of this particular movie that I really like. A
Hmm.
language model could be much more successful at giving you a small number of search results that fit those exact parameters that you have that are expressed through natural language. And that would have been more difficult to find if you're just trying to click a few search filter boxes and sift through hundreds of different results. And so I think the search experience has great potential to be totally transformed by these technologies.
In that particular example where I'm searching for something that I'm looking for using descriptive sentences, like I'm looking for a place to stay in Brooklyn and all these characteristics, how does the model determine the search outcome? It has to scan through literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of properties listed on the platform, and then do what? Pull out keywords? How would it match? Is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of folks that work in this field, I mean, I'm not, as I said, a machine learning
Sure.
researcher myself, but it's a little bit of a black box. I mean, I think we're still trying to understand really exactly how these models work. But I think at the highest level, you can just imagine the model ingesting a huge amount of data. So suppose that you were Airbnb,
Hmm.
you might be ingesting all of the information in the listing descriptions, all of the information in the reviews, maybe some auxiliary information that is not internal to Airbnb, all of the photos, all of the search data, and just learning all of these different latent connections that exist between these different pieces of text, and then drawing on those latent connections.
Yeah.
So, I mean, insofar as a lot of machine learning stuff is built on these types of models that people refer to as neural networks, I think you can really think of it as being modeled after the human brain in a way. And we can't necessarily articulate the exact reasoning that we use
Right.
to answer these types of questions, but there are these connections that are being identified in the data and they're being used to predict.
Speaking of human intervention, I remember when ChatGPT 3 first came out. It wasn't, or even 2. Anyway, when it was first released, there were criticisms that the output where the model gave unfair comparisons between Trump and Biden. If you ask the same question, about president, it gave a result for Trump that had more negative connotations than Biden, and the criticism was that human intervention played a part in it, and it became politically biased. I don't know if that's true. That's just what I saw on social media. But in reality, could this happen where we have humans intervene in the system, manipulated somehow, or put in parameters that create more biased outputs for whatever happens to be? It could be politics, could be could be economics, could be whatever the subject matter is.
Sure. I mean, in machine learning, right, there's a huge field of research where people are trying to historically understand the different biases that might exist in machine learning models. And it could be things like what you're referencing, so political bias. It could be things like bias against certain, demographic groups.
Hmm.
And so there's a lot of research on how you can train and fine tune these models to try to remove whatever biases exist. And I know some folks in that field, and a lot of the folks that were working on this for the previous generation of machine learning models are now trying to understand these phenomena and answer these questions specifically in the context of language models. There's also, I think, a related thing that you're sort of asking about here, which is, can a malicious actor maybe kind of get access to these, the way that these models are trained and maybe inject certain biases or beliefs. And I think there's active research there as well, where, insofar as a lot of these models are, being updated based on the questions that folks
Hmm.
ask, you might worry that people could ask certain questions sort of
Hmm.
strategically to try to inject certain learnings into the model. And so I think there are people who have historically worked on security type things that are thinking about how do we make these models, sort of robust to potential attacks that someone might sort of, you know,
Right.
execute against the model. I think the last thing that people have thought about, which I'll bring up and is related, and this is actually very related to the project that I mentioned earlier, this
Hmm.
experiment that we're running in Kenya, is that right now a lot of these models are trained on these large bodies of text that generally come from the Western, more developed world. And so if you think about trying to use these models in a context like Kenya, that's an emerging market. Maybe a lot of the text that the models are trained on does not come from a place like Kenya, you can imagine not going to do as well at answering people's queries just because it's not trained on the right type of data. So I think that's a concern with these models too, is that are there certain just like cultural biases or tendencies that are sort of implicitly baked into the model based on the data that's used to train them?
Can we start to see this being adopted with all search engines? Could Google, for example, one day have in their homepage just a search engine where I search for exactly that? I want a place to stay in Brooklyn with a train near me, blah blah blah, X number of restaurants. And then, instead of just searching for keywords, I search for something that I'm looking for in a more conversational style, and it outputs what I want. Are the big tech companies adopting this right now?
Yeah, that's a great question, and actually, good examples of perhaps successful implementations that I did not think to mention earlier,
Mhm.
just because they are not online marketplaces, but are instead traditional search engines. So if you use Google, they have their Bard model, and I think you can opt into using that in addition to traditional search. Microsoft similarly integrated into Bing now has not just Bing search, the traditional Bing search, but they have Bing Chat, which is a language model type search. And so I think one area in which you've started to see language models sort of get productionized and put out into the world is in the traditional search engine context. And I think you're seeing some of these large tech companies that have traditionally worked in search embrace that technology. There's tons of folks at Microsoft that are doing really interesting work on this topic because you can imagine that this type of language model based search is really helpful for certain types of queries. But for other types of things, maybe it's not as effective, right? And so I think
Yeah.
understanding the different patterns of use, are there certain things that people tend to want to use language model search for? They want to ask that question in sort of more natural language and get a more natural language based response. And then are there types of queries where people prefer the sort of more traditional version of web search where I type in a query and then I get a bunch of results fed back to me and I click a bunch of links?
Okay. Now, let's talk about online marketplaces, one of your key areas of research. We'll go through an exercise that I'm sure you do with many of your students in your classes, which is to design an optimal online marketplace, if there is such thing as something that's optimal. But maybe just in general terms, walk us through your success parameters, how you would define a successful online marketplace, and how you would execute on building this marketplace.
Yeah, absolutely. So here at Berkeley, I teach a class specifically on online marketplace and platform design. And so spend a lot of time thinking about this. I think the key thing to online marketplaces, there's a few sort of key things that need to be there, key ingredients in the recipe to make a marketplace successful. I think one is that you want there to be this sort of virtuous cycle of what we call two-sided network effects, right? So people talk a lot in business about network effects. They usually talk about one-sided network effects, right? So if I am a company that's building a telecommunications network, that network becomes more valuable to people that are using it as there are more people on the network. That's a network effect. There are similar network effects in online marketplaces, but they're kind of two-sided, where you want it to be the case that for people that are selling the goods in the marketplace, that market becomes more and more valuable as there are more people on the other side of the market that are looking to buy that good. And for folks that are looking to buy the good, the marketplace becomes more and more valuable as there are more and more sellers that are kind of selling the good. And if you can get that to be true, that these two-sided network effects are present, you sort of get the market going, you get it humming, and this sort of virtual cycle takes hold where the engine is just kind of spinning in perpetuity. The other thing that I think is kind of a like a common feature of these markets that really makes them successful is just aggregating a bunch of latent demand that previously was not aggregated, right? So if you think about some of the more successful marketplace businesses, so you think about Airbnb, for instance, there were maybe a lot of people that were open to alternative accommodations that were not hotels back when Airbnb was just getting started in the late aughts, early teens. There were also a lot of people that were open to the idea of hosting a stranger in their home to make a little bit of extra money. But prior to the creation of Airbnb, that search problem for people on both sides of that market was pretty difficult, right? So if you're a potential guest, you're sort of like, where do I find these alternative accommodations that are not hotels? Do I go looking around on Craigslist? Do I need to get on some weird email list? It was kind of unclear. And similarly, if you were someone that was trying to offer up a spare room in your home, where do you find, that person that's going to stay there? Kind of the same problem. And so that's where the value of a market like Airbnb can be really strong, is you're kind of just creating the platform for those transactions to occur. I mean, one thing that we talk about in my class in one of the early sessions is that this idea of sort of creating the platform, creating the two-sided market where these transactions can occur, is not new, right? If you go back to the Roman Empire, you had the forum, and the forum is where folks went to, find all the sellers and to buy different
Yeah.
things from merchants, and merchants knew that's where I should agglomerate in order to sell my wares. And so what we're looking at when we build an online marketplace is basically building a super technologically advanced version of the forum in Rome. But because we have computers, mobile phones, databases, machine learning algorithms, we can do a bunch of stuff that was not possible thousands of years ago, when the forum was being built and developed.
Okay. Now, in a marketplace like eBay, where people bid on prices, that the price is set by the users. But let's say if I were let's take Amazon, for example, where the seller of the product doesn't list options for bids, meaning they list one
Mhm.
price and people either take it or they leave it. In that particular environment, David, how do we design a system where the seller and the buyer reach an optimal price? In other words, how can the marketplace help the seller of the product determine an optimal price where his profit is maximized, but it's still competitive?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one thing I'll note that, just before I answer the specific question you
Yeah.
asked, is that one of the things that these markets think about a lot is how to reduce search frictions and transactional frictions, right? So you
Hmm.
want these transactions to be as easy as possible. And so one interesting thing that has been true that you could have observed is that eBay, I think, has a reputation for being a place where you go, you place some bids,
Hmm.
everything is an auction. But if you actually look over time, over the past many years, eBay has gradually been moving away from the auction format and more towards the buy it now format. And I think the reason for this is that they found that for a lot of folks on the demand side of that market, the whole auction process was very cumbersome, and
Hmm.
the buyers at least did not want to be in these auctions where they had to figure out what to bid and worry about, did I put the bid in at the right time and things like
Yeah.
that. And so I think more and more markets are trying to move to a model where it is just, here's the price, take it or leave it, click buy, and you have the item. I think where
I'll let you finish, but I just want to insert
yeah.
my own experiences. So one of the models I like, I'm not saying we should use this, but I play World of Warcraft, where I used to. And
Yeah.
in World of Warcraft, there was an auction system where, kind of like eBay, you would bid on an item that you wanted. And then, within a certain amount of time, the highest bidder gets the item. But there's also a buyout option where the
Mhm.
buyout price is significantly higher than the bid price. So if I wanted to instantly just buy that item out without waiting for my bid to win or risking not having my bid win, I would just press that button, pay a higher premium, and that'll be done. But I like that
Yeah.
system. I don't know if that's actually used in real life beyond video games.
No, I mean, yeah, in fact, I think that's the system that eBay uses in a lot of
Yeah.
cases. And
Okay.
great to hear that you're a former or current WoW. I used to play World of Warcraft as well, but no, did not spend much time in the auction house. So, but yeah, so I think there's been a movement towards more of these kind of just set a price. And I think where auctions really can be helpful for online markets are cases where neither the platform nor the seller has a good idea of what the price should be, right? So on eBay in particular, there's a lot of stuff sold where everyone involved, I think, says, I have no idea what the right price is,
Yeah.
and that's where an auction is useful. I think for platforms like maybe like an Amazon or like an Airbnb. So when I was at Airbnb, I actually helped to create the team that produces the machine learned pricing suggestions that are delivered to hosts. So I think this is an exact example of what you are referencing, where when we built this, what we saw at the time, this was I guess now almost 10 years ago, is that there was tons of Airbnb hosts that were not pricing optimally, like right. So like I mentioned earlier, the typical Airbnb host that you might have in mind is someone whose kids moved out, went to college, now they have an extra room, they want to rent it out. And if you think about that person and you say, all right, now what should the price of this room be? They have no idea. And if you ask, what's your dynamic pricing strategy for increasing price when there's a conference in town and decreasing price during the low months in the winter,
Mhm.
that they have no idea what they're doing. And so we saw an opportunity to use machine learning to try to recommend better pricing strategies to these hosts, subject to different constraints that they might have, right? They might say, I don't want to offer the room for below X price because below that price, it's just not worth it to me. And, I don't want to go above a certain price because above that price, it feels like price gouging or something. And
Yeah.
one thing that online markets can do that's really amazing at this point, and this goes back to what I mentioned earlier about just having all of this rich data that they did not have, at the forum in Rome, is you can look at historical activity in the marketplace. You can look at what prices things were listed for, whether or not they sold, how many people were looking at the detail page before they chose to buy it, how often it was coming up in search. And you can try to learn a model that sort of almost gives you a demand curve, right? So if this particular listing on this particular night were offered at this particular price, what's the probability that at least one person would purchase it? And once you have that model, you can start saying to hosts, we think that this is the price that you should offer. And if you offered that price, we think that your revenues would go up by this amount. I think that it is a kind of complicated topic, right? I mean, a lot of the sellers on these marketplaces are not sort of perfectly rational economic agents. Just because you tell them that something is going to maximize their revenues doesn't mean that they're going to accept that recommendation. And I think, especially for those sellers, there's always a concern as to whether or not the platform has their best interests in mind. Whether or not that is true is kind of immaterial, but I think the sellers might worry, does this model really have my best interests at heart, or is it just trying to get more transactions for the platform, or maybe
Mhm.
trying to, get me to lower my price when I don't want to? So even when you build the perfect model, there's kind of a tricky implementation issue, almost like more of a behavioral sciences problem of how do you get the sellers on the platform to really trust that model and trust that it has their best interests in mind.
Well, currently, what do you think are the biggest problems that need to be addressed on the biggest online platforms and marketplaces today?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that what are the biggest problems?
Or
This is not something that
areas of improvement. We don't have to give specific examples of companies, but just generally areas of improvement that could improve the user interface for both buyers and sellers. User experience, rather.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's always room to improve the search experience, and I think
Okay.
that there's always room to improve the types of information that are collected. So one area that I've done a lot of research on myself is the design of reputation systems, right? So these are
Yes.
the parts of these platforms that you and I use. David, suppose I stay in your beautiful apartment on Airbnb.
Hmm.
After I leave, I can leave you a review. You can leave me a review. Hopefully, we both leave each other 5 stars. But that process that I just described, there's actually a lot of interesting sort of behavioral dynamics that take place where you might leave me a positive review in hopes that I will feel the need to reciprocate and leave you a positive review back. And so, one piece of research I've done looks at how can we design platforms in a way that these types of expectations of reciprocity or the threat of retaliation are reduced. There's also a lot of people who stay in a place or buy something from someone, and then they say, well, that wasn't really a very good experience, but I feel bad saying anything negative, so maybe I just won't leave a review at all. And then if you're the platform designer, you're missing a bunch of information about transactions that were not high quality, where you might want to intervene, maybe remove that seller from the platform, maybe give them some training or something like that. And so there's a ton of work that goes into designing these systems, thinking exactly about how you elicit the information, when you display the information, where you display it, how you display it. And I think that ends up trickling down into how good of a how easily can someone figure out what it is that they want to purchase or what they want to buy. So I think most people are familiar with Yelp. You go to Yelp and
Yeah.
every single restaurant, it seems, has like a 4.5 or a 5-star rating. And that's sort of an instance of what we would call reputation inflation, where because of all these behavioral dynamics, the equilibrium emerges where it's just, if you're going to leave a review, leave a 5-star review or nothing else. And that makes it really hard as a consumer to sort of sift through all the information and actually find what you're looking for. So I think that this kind of question of how to collect information and then how to properly transform it and display it back to consumers is something where there's always more work to be done. And then to go back to the like a huge part of our conversation, I mean, I think thinking about how to integrate new technologies like language models is super interesting. So if you think about Upwork, right, is an online marketplace where people can hire freelancers. And I think a huge stumbling block in a lot of those potential transactions is, suppose I'm trying to hire a videographer and I've never hired a videographer before. I have no idea what to put in my job posting. I have no idea what to ask that person before hiring them. I have no idea how to communicate with them and articulate my needs as an employer. And so you can imagine that a tool like a language model could get integrated into that flow almost as an intermediary to help bridge the gap between the person who's never hired a videographer before and the videographer who kind of has a certain language and a certain vernacular for conducting transactions. And so I think also just thinking about how to integrate these new technologies into markets and platforms is going to be a big question moving forward.
Your story about Yelp and everybody getting a 4.5 just reminded me of my alma mater at McGill in the business school. They had a solution to grade inflation, which is to make the grade point average an average of B for everybody. So if everyone's getting an A, you come out getting a B, and only the extreme outliers get A's. Conversely, if everybody
Interesting.
fails, everybody's getting a B. So, you know, I don't know if you would
Not
use
bad.
that system on an online rating system where if every restaurant's getting a 4.5, you end up getting a 3 or something like that. But yeah, I see your point. Okay, David, finally, I want to close off on talking about uh maybe how the world is progressing in the online marketplace, the future of the online marketplace. Are we still going to be using the same mediums, which is websites? Are we going to be exploring other potential mediums on other hardware or software, other platforms that we haven't been commercialized yet? How do you see, 2000 years ago, we were in a physical forum, right? Like in Rome. Now we're on the internet. Well, then it was, over the phone, auction houses, whatnot. Now it's the internet. What does the future look like?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think one big question for these online marketplaces, and this is not even a technologically, related question necessarily, is whether they can be sort of sustainable businesses in the long term that people want to use and are legally allowed to use, right? So I think one thing that we've seen over the past couple of years is that a lot of the most successful marketplace businesses. So if we think about Uber or Airbnb or things like that, the platform fees have gotten higher, which have kind of driven some people away from using these platforms as opposed to traditional alternatives. Can the sellers make enough money in order to sort of make a living working on the platform? Can the consumer find a place that they want to buy or sell from? If, for instance, Airbnb is like kind of essentially illegal in large swaths of New York City now, so it makes it harder to use. So I think there's a little bit of precarity that is just A, regulatory, and B, sort of do the sort of unit economics of these platforms actually work out? But I think to get to your question about the technologies, I mean, I think that to sort of continue to go back to this language model sort of answer, I mean, I think that there's a possibility that the way that we search and the way that we think about buying things, especially things that are a little bit more idiosyncratic, might change quite a bit. And I think especially as these language models perhaps get integrated into, let's say, voice assistants or virtual reality or augmented reality type tools,
Mhm.
we might see some really big shifts in how people go about finding folks to transact with and finding things to purchase, right? So I have in my house started interacting with ChatGPT through
Wow.
the voice interface, and it's pretty amazing, right? Like if I want a recipe that I need to figure out, and I have certain ingredients in my fridge, that I guess historically I would have gone to the computer and done some
Yeah.
searches, but I can literally say, hey, I've got like a carrot and some chicken in my
You see what
refrigerator. What should I make? And
what I want is glasses, AR glasses that give me the average price of an item of all online marketplaces aggregated. So if I walk into like a Home Depot, where Walmart's a bad example because it's always cheap, but let's say I walk into any store, a retailer, and I want to buy a specific item, and the glasses scan that, and it gives me the prices of that particular item sold on eBay or Amazon or another store down the street. And if I see that it's cheaper down the street, I'm gonna leave that store and go somewhere else.
yeah, and I mean, we're not so far from that, which is kind of crazy, right? I mean, you can, with a tool like ChatGPT,
Yeah.
send it a photo and it'll tell you what's in the photo. And you
Hmm.
imagine if it gets good enough at telling you what's in that photo that it can tell
Yeah.
you, oh, this is like the exact make and model of the vacuum that's pictured. And then here's a price comparison of how much it costs at a bunch of places on the web. I mean, that is, it sounds like sci-fi futuristic stuff, but we
Yeah.
have a lot of the building blocks. And I think the main question is, when will those building blocks kind of get put together to deliver these types of very futuristic feeling experiences?
A final question for you, David. I'm just curious as to why you left physics to work in online marketplace research and the business world. Very different fields.
Yeah, great question. A thing that I still think about with not infrequently. So as a physicist, I used to work in observational cosmology, which is a couple of big words put together. But to explain what that is, so I was working on telescopes that looked at remnant light that's in the night sky, that is invisible to the human eye, but is visible in the microwave wavelength. And by sort of characterizing fluctuations in the temperature of that light in the sky, we can actually learn a lot about the birth and evolution of the universe, right? So you look at this field of light and you're learning, okay, the universe is about 13 billion years old. It's made out of about 75%, oh man, I'm forgetting the exact numbers, but it's a lot
Yeah.
of dark matter and dark
Right.
energy, not that much like actual matter, things like this. And I still find that stuff super interesting, as I think a lot of us do, right? Like you watch the Carl Sagan
Sure.
documentaries or
Sure.
something, and it's the coolest thing in the world. Um, for what I was actually doing in practice, though, as a PhD student, it's you're working on a team of like 100 people to build these telescopes. It's a
Yeah.
lot closer than it is being a scientist in a lab, and you're responsible for a really narrow
Hmm.
piece of that research. So, I just gave you this little speech about like the birth and evolution of the universe, and probably a lot of my PhD and my career as a physicist moving forward after that would have been, building mirrors that move in a certain way to
Hmm.
modulate like a particular field of light in a certain way. So you're pretty far removed maybe from the thing that you really find super interesting. And I'm a pretty social person and
Yeah.
found that human systems can also be really interesting. And there's a lot of interesting dynamics to unpack here. So I started doing this type of work, and maybe in certain ways it's not always as romantic sounding as studying the birth of the universe. But I mean, humans are fascinating creatures, and thinking about new technologies that are coming down the pike constantly, and thinking about how they can redefine the ways that we interact and the way that our society is structured is a thing that I find super interesting. And
Yeah.
so on a day-to-day level, I find this for me personally much more fun than maybe, building the mirror that moves in a certain way so that I can make a very tiny contribution to understanding the evolution of the universe.
Certainly, the math must be a lot easier. So
The
that's good.
math is definitely a lot easier. That is also true. Although if I was one of these people building these language models instead of
Yeah.
just trying to understand the societal impacts, I think the math would be just as hard, which is why I don't build the models.
All right. Fair enough. David, I appreciate your time today. Where can we learn about your research and I guess read your work?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's daveholtz.net. I also have a website on the Berkeley Haas website, and both of those are great places to look at all the work I'm doing.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for your time today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.